Law firm representing injured people. Jon Waterman is on the line with us this morning. The book is enormous. It's the Atlas of the National Parks. National Geographic puts this thing out. My goodness, Jon Waterman, what an accomplishment. This is an achievement, this book that you have been able to put out for us today. This is really tremendous. Good morning.
Good morning. Well, thank you.
It is a tremendous book talking about our national parks, showing us beautiful scenery, pictures. The articles are just wonderful. Putting this together must not have been easy.
Well, I had the advantage of having been to many of these national parks as well as having worked in a couple of them. So I've had a lifelong love of wild places that includes the national parks. So it was a perfect fit for me. And I also happen to have a lifelong love of maps.
I can tell.
The founder, yeah, there are over 200 maps in the book, and as the founder, Gilbert Grosvenor of National Geographic, said, a map is the greatest of all epic poems. And so I really felt honored to be able to spend my time putting this book together, even though it was the book that ate my brain.
I'm looking at so many wonderful pictures, and I want to tell you or ask you about each of them because I know that you took them all personally. but it's sort of like asking you to say, who's your favorite child? I mean, there have to have been some pictures you left out of this book that were just heartbreaking to leave them out.
Well, yeah. My job was to write the book and to write them with the able assistance of the cartography staff at the National Geographic as well as photo editors. And sure, we had a lot of images to choose from. I believe it's the best collection of images National Geographic has ever put together, representing over 100 different photographers from all over the world who shot pictures in these parks.
61 national parks, and this Atlas of the National Parks visits each one of them. And there are just some wonderful features of the book, and that must have been a thrill to put together. For instance, the park superlatives section just must have been fun to do.
The extremes?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, from the heat of Death Valley, the hottest temperature in the world, 134 degrees, I believe, was recorded there, and also the lowest point in North America, 282 feet below sea level, to places like Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, the world's largest known cave system, more than 400 miles of caves. So these parks are not only places of great extremes, but incredible, sort of mind-blowing natural wonders, and that's what has certainly drawn me to them. Having the opportunity to get out and explore, although I enjoy as much as the next person driving through the park and just enjoying the views. Getting out into the backcountry, to me, is the heart of the national park system, seeing the wildlife and reconnecting with nature.
Well, that's one of the things. Yeah, one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about this morning was you do such moving writing on the animals, the wildlife in our national parks, so diverse, and geographically, it's just amazing to see how the breadth of it all. And you'll write about a frog, you'll write about a polar bear, or a grizzly bear. It's just amazing the animal life that we have in this country, and you capture them in your writing. It's really a wonderful, wonderful read on top of everything else. Yeah,
well, thank you. These parks are treasures, and if the writing works, it's because I've been inspired by these parks. They were created for a number of things, for the biodiversity or spectacular scenery or the cultural heritage or the history or unique wildlife. They're all unique.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the fauna, the flora at these national parks is just mind-boggling as well. It's such a wonderful, wonderful thing. You take us into each of these national parks, and you give us an opportunity to learn unique things about them, and great things about our historical attachment to these parks as well. The sequoias are just, the story of them and the history of them. There's an amazing old photograph of this enormous group of people that took part in the downing of this giant redwood. And you give us the opportunity to see how we have looked at these national parks and these resources down through the years and how those views have changed.
Yeah, I've always been a fan of history and learning where we came from, and so I had also the opportunity to explore the people who had the vision to create each of these parks, and in many instances to share narratives about John Muir in Yosemite, for instance, or Teddy Roosevelt. And not only his vision in the park, the only park named after President Teddy Roosevelt National Park, but his vision in setting aside more and more parks, one of the greatest conservationists in history. So these parks are a great democratic ideal. It's showing our democracy at one of its finest moments, because these parks belong to all of us, and they're accessible and open to all of us, while at the same time we provide the service of preserving everything within and performing science.
Jon Waterman is our guest. This amazing book that we're talking about this morning is The Atlas of the National Parks. National Geographic has published this book, and Jon, of course, award-winning author and a filmmaker and an adventurer. You mentioned you've been to many of these parks, and I'm sure that there are some on your wish list, aren't there, that you can't wait to get to now, especially after seeing this book come together.
Yeah, Isle Royale and Dry Tortuga, two of the least visited parks in the lower 48, are high on my must-visit list. Because there are very few visitors that go to those two parks. And in Isle Royale, in the middle of Lake Superior, for instance, in Michigan, there is the longest-running predator-prey study in the world, the predator-prey being the wolves and the moose. And they've just recently had to reintroduce the wolves to that island because a rare freeze-over, the last wolf left, so now they have a half dozen wolves back on the island. Or, as I mentioned, the Dry Tortuga, a park that many people may not have heard of, south of Florida, is part of the largest reef system coral reef system in North America. And the only way you can get there also is by boat or float plane. So that's the place that, like Isle Royale, where you'd want to snorkel or dive or go to watch the bird life instead of the wolves and the moose.
I mentioned earlier that this particular book is not only a coffee table book, it's bigger than most coffee tables, and it's just an amazing accomplishment. Tell me about the organization of the book, how it was that it was put together, because you visit different regions, and the organization of the book is really a fascinating story as well.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I determined it was my vision and how to lay out this book, and that simply involved going back to the creation of the National Park Service in 1916. The Secretary of the Interior asked the Director of the Park Service to look for pleasing natural architecture and scenic views and wonders of wildlife, and several other criteria. So I listed all this criteria and went through each of the 61 parks. And the ones, of course, places like Yellowstone or Denali National Park that seemed to encompass most of the 16 pieces of criteria that I described, had the feature layouts. And then within, I would determine what the most compelling stories were, whether it be human history, cultural Native American history, for instance, to the creation of the park, or the geology, or in Yellowstone, of course, the narrative about this simmering 2,200 degree Fahrenheit underground caldera that's could blow at any time. It could go off tomorrow, or it might not go off for 10,000 years.
Yeah.
But when it blows again, that is when it erupts as an incredible supervolcano, it will devastate much of the western North America. And so I found stories like that for every one of the parks, some known and some little known.
It's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful to sit down for hours at a time with this book. And you mentioned maps before. One of the things we need to point out to folks is that each of the parks that are highlighted here, the 61 national parks, has a brand new map. At least one brand new map for each of these parks must have been a thrill for you.
It really was. I've been a lover of maps since I was a teenager. Now for 50 years, I've just loved to look at maps, and so we've taken the trouble to find some of the historic maps for places like Mount Rainier National Park and Grand Canyon, an incredible map that was done of the Grand Canyon. And we worked also directly with Harper's Ferry, with the National Park Service cartographers, to use their parks, and we styled them with a National Geographic look. And then came up with other maps and illustrations to complement the maps. Flipping through Yellowstone, you'll find there are 5 different maps that show not only the actual topography of the park, but populations of wildlife, locations of calderas, or in the Great Smoky Mountains, we have a major page devoted to forest habitats, whether it's hemlocks or pine and oak or spruce fir. So we've taken infinite care in selecting not only the maps but the illustrations that help and complement the narratives within the parks.
Jon Waterman has been kind enough to be with us, the Atlas of the National Parks. You can find him on Facebook at Nat Geo Books. Jon, thank you so much. This has been fun.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day. We'll see you. It is the voice of Indiana County, WCCS, AM 1160, 101.1 FM, and we went right up to the marker today, boys and girls. Kilmeade is next.